Alec Baldwin's lawyers are saying, no, look, the gun was defective. It's broken. Well, of course, it was broken in the course of the testing. It wasn't broken when it was in Alec Baldwin's hands. And then the state commissioned a firearms examiner report that only recently was provided to the defense and resulted in yet another motion by the defense. And this is that motion. This was filed August 15th. So more than the 60 days after the July 9th filing by the prosecution, right? Just a couple weeks ago, a week or so ago, August 15th. And that's why this show was covering Alec Baldwin, is because of this recent filing. So let me pull this up. And this is where the Hannah Gutierrez-Reed defense is again making this argument about a unforeseeable intervening cause, meaning Alec Baldwin's handling of the gun, that cuts off the criminal liability for Hannah Gutierrez-Reed. That's the argument they're making. And what they're asking for here is defendant's motion requesting jury instruction of causation. They're asking for a jury instruction. Now, this is still pre-trial, but pre-trial is where you define the legal battlefield for the trial. And so pre-trial, they're asking the judge to agree to give the jury an instruction about unforeseeable intervening causes. Because if the jury buys that, it would acquit Hannah Gutierrez-Reed, their client, of criminal liability. So this reads, the special prosecutors, meaning just the prosecutors, have previously stated that they had information that there was an alleged modification of the gun used by Baldwin on the Rust set. In other words, the prosecutors have claimed, well, it looks to us like there was a defect in the gun that just made it go off by itself. So Alec Baldwin had nothing to do with the gun discharging. The prosecution indicated that they believed this impacted causation of the manslaughter as to Baldwin, but not as to Ms. Gutierrez-Reed, because a defect in the gun would have nothing to do with what her allegedly reckless conduct is. Her allegedly reckless conduct is she allowed live ammo on the set and did not herself ensure there was no live ammo in the gun before it went to Baldwin. A defect in the gun has nothing to do with those things. Continuing, this was the basis for dismissal of charges against Baldwin without prejudice. We now have received the prosecution's gun report by their experts, Lucien Hagg and Mike Hagg. The Hagg report, and we're going to look at that in a moment, that's attached. By the way, for law self-defense members, both of these motions will be linked as resources or references in today's blog post of the show when the replay version goes up. So you can read we're only going to look at a couple pages of the firearms report. The whole thing's pretty interesting, but it's like 40 pages long, so we can't read the whole thing. I'm just going to jump to the end, their conclusion, for purposes of today's show. The Hagg report does not indicate any modification to the gun. The report further expresses that when parts broken by the FBI in testing were replaced, the gun fired as designed, meaning only when the trigger was depressed. The FBI had previously stated in its report that the gun functioned as designed before parts were broken during destructive testing. Evidence at trial will show that Ms. Gutierrez-Reed had asked Assistant Director Halls, had asked him that she be called back into the church where the shooting happened if Baldwin was going to use the gun at all. Halls did not call her back into the church. Halls was the person who actually handed the gun to Baldwin, which is not how it's supposed to be done. The armorer is supposed to be in total control of all the real guns until the armorer hands them to the actor. This was a low-budget set. Not everybody had a high level of expertise. And the church where it happened was very small, confined space. So maybe that's part of what led to all this. But Assistant Director Halls did not call her back into the church before the gun discharged. Had Hannah been present in the church, under no circumstances would she have allowed, one, Baldwin to perform the cross draw with his finger on the trigger. Two, she would not have allowed Baldwin to point the gun directly at another person. And 3, the rounds in the weapon would have been checked again to make sure they were dummy rounds and not live rounds. So, of course, this is Gutierrez-Reed defense attorneys arguing, hey, these checks did not happen, not because of the fault of our client, but because of the fault of other people. Continuing, Baldwin pointing the gun at Miss Hutchins and pulling the trigger are independent intervening causes. In an uninterrupted sequence of events, Hannah would have been called into the church to perform her job as the armorer on the film. Hannah had no knowledge the gun would be used in a church scene, let alone be pointed at a person. The Hague report specifies that the trigger had to be pulled and rules out certain types of accidental discharge. Quoting now from the report, quote, although Alec Baldwin repeatedly denies pulling the trigger, given the tests, findings, and observations reported here, the trigger had to be pulled or depressed sufficiently to release the fully cocked or retracted hammer of the evidence revolver. If the hammer had not been fully retracted to the rear and were to slip from the handler's thumb without the trigger depressed, the half-cock or quarter-cock notches in the hammer should have prevented the firing pin from reaching any cartridge in the firing chamber. If these features were somehow bypassed, a conspicuously off-center firing pin impression would result. Close quote. Continuing now with the defense motion, Ms. Gutierrez-Reed is requesting a ruling in advance of trial that these jury instructions be given as jury instructions on causation, which are copied in full below. And I'm not going to read the full jury instructions. I'll just note that they're informing the jury about that the misconduct of the defendant to result in a guilty verdict had to have been uninterrupted by an outside event. And of course, Hannah Gutierrez-Reed here is arguing that whatever culpability she might have, it was interrupted by an outside event, the conduct of Alec Baldwin. And the key part of the second jury instructions requested is that Hannah Gutierrez-Reed can only be found guilty if her conduct constitutes, that the jury cannot find her guilty if Alec Baldwin's conduct constitutes an intervening cause that breaks the foreseeable chain of events. So the whole paragraph here, if you find the negligence of a person other than the defendant, so Alec Baldwin, rather than Hannah Gutierrez-Reed, was the only significant cause of death or constitutes an intervening cause that breaks the foreseeable chain of events, then the defendant is not guilty. So that's what the defense is going for here, that jury instruction to the jury. Then we get to the medical examiner's report. Very long. I'm not going to read the whole thing here. I'm just going to jump to the end, the conclusions, part of which was just quoted in the motion for those jury instructions. But again, I will link this report for law self-defense members. Another benefit of being a law self-defense member, folks, is you get all these additional resources that we don't put on YouTube or Twitter or Rumble. So you might consider becoming a member for just 99 cents for a 2-week trial, unlimited access to all our members-only content, transcripts of the shows, these additional kinds of resources. 99 cents for 2 weeks, 200% money back guarantee. It's a negative risk proposition, folks. And after the 2 weeks, it's only about 30 cents a day to be a member, less than $10 a month to be a law self-defense member. So back to the, and of course you can do that at lawofselfdefense.com/trial for the trial membership. All right, so back to the firearms examiner reports. There's a blank round there. There's also dummy cartridges involved with holes drilled in them. So you can tell even tactilely that it's a dummy round. And let's get to the end here. So the conclusion, the fatal incident. From the firearms examiner's report that the defense was just given recently. From an examination of the fired cartridge case and the operationally restored evidence, so they replaced the broken parts, the parts the FBI broke inside the gun, they replaced them with parts that were identical before they were broken. and the operationally restored evidence revolver, this fatal incident was the consequence of the hammer being manually retracted to its fully rearward and cocked position, followed at some point by the pull or rearward depression of the trigger. The only conceivable alternative to the foregoing would be a situation in which the trigger was already pulled or held rearward while retracting the hammer to the full cock position. Although unlikely and totally contrary to the normal operation of this single-action revolver, such improper handling would result in the discharge of a live cartridge. So the point here is you had to have both things. The sequence doesn't matter. The hammer cocked and the trigger depressed, or the trigger held rearward and the hammer cocked and released. Continuing, at the moment of discharge, the evidence revolver was pointed at Helena Hutchins, behind whom was Joel Souza, both of whom were struck by the fired round. The bullet passed completely through Helena Hutchins, then nearly passed through Joel Souza, ending up just under the skin of his back, from which it was removed at the hospital. Although Alec Baldwin repeatedly denies pulling the trigger, given the tests, findings, and observations reported here, the trigger had to be pulled or depressed sufficiently to release the fully cocked or retracted hammer of the evidence revolver. If the hammer had not been fully retracted, and this part I read from the motion, but I'll read it again. If the hammer had not been fully retracted to the rear and were to slip from the handler's thumb without the trigger depressed, the half cock or quarter cock notches in the hammer should have prevented the firing pin from reaching any cartridge in the firing chamber. If these features were somehow bypassed, a conspicuously off-center firing pin impression would result, which didn't happen. 3 frames from one of the videos submitted to this writer on April 19th, 2023, and 2 frames from a second video received on that same date are useful in evaluating his account, Alec Baldwin's account of the incident. Figures 21, A, B, and C show Mr. Baldwin cocking the silver-colored hammer of a long-barreled revolver with his right thumb, ending up, I see. Cocking the hammer, should be a comma here, with his right index finger ending up on or near the trigger. This description of the revolver in the video corresponds to the evidence revolver. And so here's, let's make it bigger so we can all see. There's his finger near the trigger, certainly. There's his finger. It looks like it's through the trigger guard here. There's his finger. Again, looks like it's through the trigger guard here. And then 2 more figures. Figures 22A and 22B, taken from the second video, show 2 frames from 2 fast draw demonstrations in which Mr. Baldwin's right index finger is inside the trigger guard and either on or near the trigger. His thumb is not in contact with the hammer. So you can see his fingers through the trigger guard curled around the trigger. And folks, if you've never handled one of these single action revolvers, the trigger is quite different than a modern double action revolver, which tends to be a fairly broad, wide trigger blade, a flat surface against your finger. On these single action revolvers, the trigger is often very, very thin. And of course, when the hammer is cocked, the amount of pressure required to release the hammer is very, very slight. Index on the trigger, index finger on the trigger. Again. So, if this is what caused the gun to discharge, Hannah Gutierrez-Reed's lawyers are saying, hey, him pointing the gun at Helena Hutchins, cocking the hammer, pressing the trigger, which the state's firearms examiners are saying had to happen in order for the gun to discharge, without calling in Hannah Gutierrez-Reed, the armorer, as she'd requested, into the church before this gun was handled, so that she could prohibit him from pointing it at Helena Hutchins and ensure the gun was still unloaded. This conduct was an unforeseeable intervening cause that ends the liability, the criminal liability of Hannah Gutierrez-Reed's, and shifts it entirely onto Alec Baldwin. That's the defense argument of the Hannah Gutierrez-Reed crew. That's why they want these jury instructions about an unforeseeable intervening cause.